Samuel Carter bowed his head as he stepped onto the train car with a quiet demeanor, deliberately maintaining an unremarkable appearance. His outfit, a faded gray sweater, worn out jeans, and sneakers with frayed edges, made him look like just another anonymous passenger among hundreds of others. A baseball cap pulled low over his face served as a subtle shield, one that had helped him evade countless cameras during his years managing the largest high speed rail company in the United States. Samuel chose a seat in the economy class, one of the busiest sections of the train. Passengers bustled about, some hurriedly stowing luggage in the overhead bins, others carefully locating their assigned seats. The hum of conversations blended with the rhythmic clatter of the train, forming a familiar soundtrack. Samuel placed his small bag in the luggage rack and quickly scanned the train car with sharp, observant eyes. For others, this was just an ordinary train ride, but for Samuel, it was an opportunity to personally assess everything, from the staff's service attitude to the seat quality, down to the smallest details like the cleanliness of the car and the reliability of the Wi Fi. He had spent years building this high speed rail network from a modest project into a national system. Despite its resounding success, Samuel never forgot his father's lesson. To lead well, you must understand every cog in the machine. His seat by the window was next to a young couple enthusiastically discussing their trip. Samuel offered a polite smile, striving to appear as harmless as possible. Just as he settled in, two other passengers entered from the rear door of the car, immediately catching his attention. One was an older man with a strong presence, despite the weathered lines etched into his face. He wore a battered leather jacket and a frayed baseball cap. The other was younger, with dyed light-colored hair, looking awkward and visibly uneasy. They took the row of seats directly behind Samuel, their movements rustling enough to draw his notice. "Relax," the older man said in a deep, gravelly voice. "No one checks on us here. They only care about first class. Nobody pays attention to economy." Samuel tensed slightly. The seemingly casual remark sparked his curiosity. He remained calm, his hand casually gripping the edge of the seat as he feigned relaxation, all the while attuned to the conversation unfolding behind him. The younger man murmured something too low to discern, and the older man responded, "Don't worry. Once we get to the next station, everything will begin. We need to send the message, and this train is the perfect choice." Samuel's heart raced. Though vague, those words triggered his instinct for caution. He told himself he might be overreacting, but years of experience had taught him never to ignore even the smallest detail. If something was truly amiss, he needed to find out. The train began to move, a gentle vibration accompanying its gradual acceleration along the tracks. Samuel closed his eyes, pretending to be a weary traveler nodding off, but his mind worked relentlessly. Every sound, every fragment of dialogue from behind him was etched into his memory. It wasn't just concern for the safety of the train, it was also his responsibility as someone whose reputation and career were tied to each journey. As the train departed the first station, Samuel resolved to observe further. Maybe they're just regular passengers, he tried to reassure himself, yet his instincts continued to whisper that something about this situation was far from ordinary. Samuel maintained a composed demeanor as the train raced forward at high speed, gliding past sprawling fields and small scattered neighborhoods along the way. The sounds of the train car, the faint hum of the engine, the murmurs of passengers, and the clicking of the beverage cart blended into a familiar rhythm Samuel had experienced countless times before. Yet his attention remained fixed on the two passengers seated directly behind him. "We have to stick to the plan." The older man's voice rang out, clearer now as the train settled into its smooth acceleration. Samuel straightened slightly in his seat, his hand pretending to adjust his jacket. He could feel the tension in the man's tone, even though it was intentionally subdued. "I just don't know. If it's worth it," the younger man replied, his voice tinged with hesitation. Samuel detected a trace of conflict in his tone, not confidence, but uncertainty, as though he had been thrust into a situation he wasn't entirely comfortable with. "Don't worry. When we reach the station, just do your part," the older man responded. "We need to get people's attention. Remember, this isn't just about us, it's about everyone who's been exploited by them." Samuel frowned. Who were they? And what was the goal of these two men? The question swirled in his mind as he tried to piece together the fragments of their cryptic conversation. Their vague mentions of a plan and message left him feeling anything but reassured. A train attendant wheeled the beverage cart down the aisle, her familiar smile lighting up the space. It was Ella Morgan, a veteran employee who had been with the high-speed rail company since Samuel had founded it. Though he didn't look directly at her, Samuel instantly recognized Ella's professionalism as she interacted with passengers. He reminded himself that if the situation escalated, Ella might be the first person he could rely on. "Can I get you anything?" Ella paused beside his seat, her voice gentle. Samuel looked up, giving her a faint smile and motioning for her to move on. He didn't want to interrupt his observations. Behind him, the older man's voice resurfaced. "Don't let your nerves get the better of you. Remember why we're here. You don't want them thinking you're a coward, do you?" "I'm not a coward," the younger man snapped, his voice rising slightly, as though he needed to convince himself more than anyone else. Samuel sensed the tension between them intensifying. He leaned forward slightly, pretending to rummage through the pocket of the seat in front of him. In that fleeting moment, he caught a glimpse of the older man holding a small black bag on his lap, his rough hand tapping rhythmically against it as if to steady himself. Meanwhile, the younger man sat rigid, his eyes darting around nervously, as though fearing he might be caught. Samuel knew he needed to act, but didn't want to cause unnecessary alarm if this was all just a misunderstanding. He took a deep breath, reminding himself to remain patient. Any rash decision could lead to serious consequences. As the train entered a dark tunnel, the lights in the car flickered briefly before stabilizing again. The sudden darkness heightened Samuel's awareness of the murmurs behind him. The older man said something Samuel couldn't make out, but moments later, the younger man responded in a trembling voice, "I just don't want to get caught. If they find out, we'll be in serious trouble." "Calm down. We've planned for everything," the older man whispered. "Remember, we're not doing anything wrong. This is the only way to make them listen." Samuel sat up straighter, his mind tense like a drawn bowstring. Who were they, and what was the message? He couldn't bear the ambiguity any longer, but standing up now and confronting them could spark unnecessary panic in the train car. As the light outside returned, revealing vast green fields, Samuel decided to try a different approach. He stood up, feigning a stretch, and began walking down the aisle toward the train car's door. He felt the older man's glance briefly land on him before returning to their conversation. Near the door, Samuel adjusted his cap and looked out the window, though his real focus was on the reflection in the glass. He discreetly observed the pair behind him. The older man still held the small black bag, his fingers tapping it rhythmically, while the younger man darted his eyes around nervously, his anxiety palpable. "You need to toughen up, Marcus," the older man said, his voice low but clear. "If you can't do this, then everything we've worked for will be for nothing." Samuel furrowed his brow. Marcus. The name etched itself into his memory. This could be the key detail he needed if he had to verify their identities later. As Samuel returned to his seat, he accidentally caught the eye of Ella Morgan. She glanced at him curiously, as though sensing something was off. Samuel gave her a subtle nod, a small signal he knew she would understand. His plan now was crystal clear: keep observing, gather more information, and wait until the train reached the next station, where he would act if the situation escalated further. The high-speed train slowed down, the distinctive sound of metal wheels gliding over tracks gradually fading as they approached the mid-route stop. Samuel glanced out the window and spotted the familiar sign for Springfield Station, a small but busy transit hub. From here, passengers could transfer to other trains or catch buses to suburban areas. As the train came to a full stop, Samuel sensed a shift in the atmosphere. The bustling crowd inside the car began to stir. Some passengers stood up to disembark, while others waited for new passengers to board. However, his attention wasn't on the commotion, but remained focused on the two men seated behind him. "It's time," the older man's voice rang out, low and firm. "Are you sure?" Marcus, the younger man, asked, his voice betraying clear nervousness. "Absolutely. This is the perfect moment. Just stick to the plan." Samuel lowered his head, pretending to check his shoelaces to listen more closely. His heart pounded. Anyone overhearing this conversation would feel uneasy. He still didn't know exactly what their plan was, but it was evident that it wasn't something ordinary. As the new passengers began settling into their seats, Samuel glanced out of the corner of his eye. The older man had stood up, carrying the familiar black bag with Marcus following awkwardly behind. Both moved toward the back of the car, heading to the door connecting to the next car. Samuel waited a few seconds before standing up and following them at a safe distance. When they exited the car, Samuel walked slowly, maintaining a casual demeanor. He stopped near the door, just enough to see them heading onto the platform. Garland, the older man, placed the black bag nench and pulled a large roll of paper from his jacket pocket. Marcus stood by his side, looking visibly uneasy, his eyes darting nervously between Garland and the crowd around them. Samuel quickly scanned the platform, looking for any security personnel. But Springfield Station was small, with no visible security presence. Only a few ticketing staff and hurried passengers filled the platform. Garland unrolled the paper, revealing a large banner with bold red text that read, "Demand justice for the exploited." Samuel felt a wave of unease rise in his chest. This wasn't just a simple protest, it was a deliberate attempt to deliver a larger message right in the middle of the train station, with the potential to disrupt the entire journey. "Marcus, help me hang this up," Garland commanded, his tone authoritative. Marcus hesitated, but eventually complied, taking one end of the banner and securing it to the bench. Passengers on the platform began to take notice, with a few even pulling out their phones to snap photos or record videos. Samuel sensed the growing risk. If this situation wasn't handled carefully, it could escalate into a large-scale demonstration, disrupting the train's schedule and causing significant damage to the company's reputation. Yet he also knew that any hasty action on his part could push things out of control. "We should say something, shouldn't we?" Marcus asked, his anxious eyes betraying his unease. "Just standing here won't accomplish anything." Garland smirked, his expression calculated. "Let the banner speak for itself. The greatest action is forcing them to take notice." Samuel took a deep breath and stepped toward the two men. He knew he couldn't wait any longer. "Excuse me," Samuel called out, keeping his tone calm but firm. "What exactly are you two doing here?" Garland turned to face him, looking him up and down with a suspicious glare. "We're not doing anything wrong. This is a public station, and we have the right to express our views." Marcus appeared startled, recognizing Samuel as the man he had seen on the train. "Who are you? Why are you following us?" Marcus demanded, his voice rising with tension. Samuel gave a faint smile, but his gaze stayed fixed on Garland. "I'm just a curious passenger. What you're doing seems interesting." "Interesting?" Garland raised an eyebrow. "I suppose it is interesting enough to catch the attention of people like you." Samuel knew he needed to buy time, at least until a staff member or security officer could arrive. He glanced around, scanning for Ella Morgan or anyone else who might assist. "I don't think this is the best way to get your message across," Samuel said, his voice steady and measured. "There are other ways to make people listen without causing a scene here." "Causing a scene?" Garland laughed, his tone dripping with disdain. "You think we're causing a scene? No, we're demanding justice. People like you will never understand." Samuel didn't respond immediately. He knew words alone wouldn't change Garland's mind, but when his eyes met Marcus's, he noticed the younger man's hesitation, as if he were genuinely reconsidering what they were doing. "Do you really think this is the best way?" Samuel asked, addressing Marcus directly. Marcus opened his mouth to reply, but before he could, Garland interjected. "He doesn't need to answer you. Come on, Marcus. We don't have time for anyone standing in our way." Samuel watched as Garland pulled Marcus along, leaving the large banner still hanging prominently on the platform. Part of him wanted to stop them right then and there, but he knew the situation required careful handling. He spotted Ella Morgan stepping off the train, her eyes meeting his with a look of readiness. Samuel quickly approached her and spoke in a low voice. "Call station security now. We need to address this before the train departs." Ella nodded, immediately pulling out her phone. Samuel turned back, his gaze following Garland and Marcus as he reminded himself that this was only the beginning. Samuel stood still on the platform, his eyes fixed on Garland and Marcus, who were standing about paces away. Garland seemed different to Samuel's presence, but Marcus was different. The young man couldn't hide his furtive glances, occasionally sneaking a hesitant look in Samuel's direction. The train whistle blew, signaling its imminent departure. Passengers hurried to board, and the platform gradually emptied. Meanwhile, Garland's large banner remained tied to the bench, its bold red lettering catching the eyes of anyone still lingering. A few people stopped to take pictures or record videos, increasing Samuel's concern about the potential consequences. Ella Morgan appeared beside Samuel and spoke softly. "I've called station security. They're on their way, but it might take a few minutes." Samuel nodded. "Thank you. We need to keep this under control. No one can panic." "Do you think they're really dangerous?" Ella asked, her voice low but steady. Samuel glanced at Ella, weighing his response. "I'm not sure they're planning violence, but actions like these can escalate faster than you'd expect. And whatever happens here could directly impact the company." Ella nodded again, her gaze shifting to Garland and Marcus. "What do you want me to do?" "Just be ready. If things get worse, I might need you to step in." As they spoke, Garland suddenly raised his voice, breaking the silence. His words echoed across the platform. "They exploit us, strip away opportunities from the poor, and use their wealth to silence us. It's time to rise up." A few passengers stopped, curious, while others exchanged whispers. One woman leaned toward her companion and asked, "What's going on? Is this a protest?" Samuel knew this was the decisive moment. He took a deep breath, then walked directly toward Garland. Each step he took was slow but deliberate, his gaze locked on the older man standing in the middle of the platform. "Excuse me," Samuel said, his voice carrying enough weight to draw the attention of both Garland and Marcus. "I think we need to talk." Garland turned, squinting at Samuel. "You again? Don't you understand this has nothing to do with you?" "Unfortunately, I think it does," Samuel replied, his tone calm but firm. "Because what you're doing here affects not just me, but a lot of other people." Garland gave a derisive laugh. "Affects? You think our demand for justice is the problem? You're just another beneficiary of this broken system." Samuel held Garland's gaze steadily. "Justice is important, I won't deny that. But is this the best way to achieve it? Or is it only making things worse for the very people you claim to be helping?" Marcus took a small step back, his eyes darting between Samuel and Garland. The younger man was visibly conflicted, yet he lacked the courage to voice his doubts. Garland, on the other hand, remained resolute. "You don't know anything," he said, his voice rising with anger. "I've seen what this system does to people like us, and if you think I'm going to sit back and wait, you're mistaken." Samuel nodded slowly. "Maybe you're right. Maybe I don't understand everything you've been through. But I do know that causing a disruption here won't change anything. It will only make people see you and your group as troublemakers, rather than as people trying to make a real difference." Garland opened his mouth to respond, but Marcus suddenly spoke up, his voice small yet audible enough to be heard. "Maybe he has a point," Marcus said. Both Garland and Samuel turned to him. "I mean, we need people to listen, but I'm not sure this is the best way to do it." "What are you saying?" Garland snapped at Marcus, his voice laced with anger. "You think we can do anything else? You think they'll listen if we just stand around and stay silent?" "No," Marcus replied, his voice growing quieter. "But—" Garland cut him off. "Enough. If you don't have the courage to stand up, then you don't belong here." Samuel watched the exchange between the two, recognizing the fracture that was beginning to form. He decided to seize the moment. "Marcus, would you like to hear what I have to say?" Samuel asked, his tone softer now. Marcus turned to look at Samuel, his eyes filled with conflict. "What do you want to say?" "I want to say that if we really want to change something, we need to work together, not against each other. I'm willing to listen to everything you have to say, if you're willing to sit down and talk." Garland let out a cold laugh. "Don't listen to him, Marcus. He's just trying to break our spirit." But Marcus didn't immediately answer Garland. He bowed his head, remaining silent for a few seconds before suddenly turning back to Samuel. "If you're serious, then I'll talk. But I need to see you actually do something." Samuel nodded. "That's exactly what I want." At that moment, station security arrived, moving toward Garland and Marcus. Samuel quickly intervened, signaling for them to avoid taking any harsh actions. He wanted to handle the situation peacefully, at least for now. "We can sit down and talk," Samuel said to both Garland and Marcus. "But first, let's take down the banner. This isn't the right place to address these issues." Garland glared at Samuel with contempt, his eyes sharp and unyielding. But Marcus, after a few moments of hesitation, removed the banner. "All right," he said. "Let's talk." Samuel knew this was only the first step, but he felt a faint glimmer of hope. Turning to Ella, he quietly said, "Prepare a place where we can have a private discussion. Things are just getting started." Samuel Carter sat in a small room inside Springfield Station, facing Marcus and Garland. The large banner with its bold red lettering was neatly set aside, serving as a quiet reminder of the tension that had unfolded outside on the platform. Samuel maintained a calm demeanor, but he knew that every word he spoke now could determine the course of what happened next. Marcus sat next to Garland, looking hesitant, his eyes darting between Samuel and the older man beside him. Garland, in contrast, sat upright, his gaze hard and full of suspicion. "So," Samuel began, breaking the silence, "perhaps you can start by explaining your goal more clearly. I want to understand why you chose this approach." Garland smirked, a glint of mockery in his eyes. "You want to understand? A wealthy man like you, running a major company, wants to understand the struggles we face? How laughable." Samuel nodded slightly, unfazed by the jab. "I don't deny that we may live in very different worlds, but that doesn't mean I'm unwilling to listen. If I didn't want to, I wouldn't be sitting here." Marcus glanced at Garland as if waiting for him to say something, but Garland simply crossed his arms, leaning back in his chair, making it clear he had no intention of continuing. Samuel decided to shift his focus to Marcus. "You're Marcus, right?" Samuel asked, lowering his voice to ease the tension. Marcus nodded. "That's right." "You seem like you're new to this group," Samuel continued. "I don't say that as a criticism. I'm just curious. What brought you here?" Marcus hesitated for a moment before answering. I I wanted to do something meaningful. Garland told me we could make a difference, help give a voice to those who don't have one." Samuel nodded, his expression reflecting genuine respect. "That's a noble goal. But do you think the approach you're taking now is the best way to achieve it?" Garland suddenly interjected, his tone sharp. "The best way? People like you always talk about better ways, but in reality, it's just empty promises to buy time. We've waited long enough." Samuel remained composed. He turned to Garland, his gaze serious yet sincere. "I won't deny that there are issues that need addressing, but I genuinely want to understand what makes you feel so wronged. And if there's something I can do to make it right, I'm willing to try." Garland let out a laugh, though this time it wasn't mocking. "You talk as if you're the only one who gets to decide anything, but the truth is you're just a small cog in a much bigger system. Even if you want change, the system will fight you." Samuel leaned forward slightly, his voice low and resolute. "You may be right, but if we don't try, how will we ever know? I'm not here to defend any system. I'm here to clarify what's happening and find a way to fix it." The room fell silent. Marcus looked at Garland, then back at Samuel. He seemed to be weighing his thoughts. Finally, he spoke up. "If you're really serious, I want to know why your company refuses to hire more people from areas like mine." Samuel frowned slightly. "Areas like yours?" "Yes," Marcus said, his voice growing stronger. "I've heard that your company avoids hiring from areas with a high minority population. Is that true?" Samuel sat up straight, his gaze sharpening. "I don't know where you heard that, but I can assure you that my company's hiring policies do not discriminate. However, if there are any specific instances of unfairness, I'm willing to investigate." Marcus stared at Samuel, as though searching for sincerity in his words. Finally, he gave a small nod. "All right, but I want to see action, not just words." Samuel smiled. "You will. And I want to make it happen with you, if you're willing to collaborate." Garland, who had been silent until now, let out a scoff. "Collaborate? You think a few promises and a meeting like this are enough for us to trust you?" Samuel met Garland's piercing gaze with calm composure. "I don't expect you to trust me immediately, but I hope that, over time, we can build trust." Garland stood up, his eyes sweeping over Samuel with disdain. "We'll see what you can do, but don't think for a second that we'll just sit back and wait." With that, Garland turned and walked out of the room. Marcus hesitated for a moment before rising to follow. Just before leaving, he turned back to Samuel and said quietly but clearly, "I'll be watching to see if you keep your word." As the two left, Samuel leaned back in his chair, exhaling deeply. He knew this was only the beginning, but at least he had opened the door to dialogue. Ella stepped into the room, her expression one of understanding. "What do you think?" she asked. "I think this is more complicated than I imagined," Samuel replied, his eyes gazing into the distance. "But I'm not giving up. We need to prepare for the next step." Ella nodded. "What's the next step?" Samuel smiled, determination lighting up his eyes. We're going to hold a larger meeting, a public forum where anyone can ask questions and we'll answer with action. A week after the events at Springfield Station, Samuel Carter hosted a public forum at the largest convention center in Chicago, not far from the endpoint of the high-speed rail. News of the meeting spread quickly, drawing the attention of the media and various social advocacy groups, including Garland and Marcus. The conference room was packed. Samuel sat on the main stage, flanked by a large display board showing data on hiring policies, labor conditions, and the initiatives his company had implemented over the years. However, he knew that these dry statistics would not be enough to pacify the anger of those who felt overlooked. Garland and Marcus entered the room. Marcus looked tense, while Garland radiated confidence, as if ready for a battle he expected to win. Samuel noticed them and gave a small nod, but Garland did not acknowledge it. As Samuel stood to begin his speech, the room fell silent. He took a deep breath, his gaze sweeping over the crowd in front of him. This was his chance to seize the moment, or everything could fall apart. "Thank you all for being here today," he began, his voice clear and steady. "I know that many of you feel frustrated, angry, and even disillusioned with the system. I'm not here to deny those feelings. Instead, I'm here to listen." Samuel paused, letting his words settle into the room. I also won't deny that my company is not perfect, but I believe that instead of working against each other, we can work together to address these issues. I'd like to start by answering any questions you may have." A hand shot up immediately. It belonged to a sharp-eyed, middle-aged woman. "Why doesn't your company hire enough people from low-income communities, even though they have the skills and are eager to work?" Samuel smiled lightly. "That's an excellent question. And to answer it, I'd like to show you this." He gestured to the technical team, who projected a chart onto the screen, showing employee distribution by geographic area. "These are real figures from last year. While we've made efforts to improve diversity, I admit there are still areas that are underrepresented. That's why I want to hear from you and find ways to change." Garland, sitting in the front row with his arms crossed, looked unimpressed. He stood abruptly, not waiting for his turn, and spoke up. "I don't need charts. I want to know if you're willing to commit, right here and now, that your company will hire at least 30% of its employees from these neglected areas." The room buzzed with murmurs as every eye turned to Samuel. He knew it was a challenging question. Agreeing without a clear plan would amount to an empty promise, but declining could intensify the opposition. Samuel stepped to the edge of the stage, facing Garland directly. "Mr. Garland, I'm not here to make promises I can't keep, but I'm ready to commit to this. We will launch a special hiring program focused on the areas you mentioned, ensuring no one is discriminated against. We'll start with 15% next year and increase that number based on the results we achieve." Garland gave a derisive chuckle. 15%? Is that all you can do? "That's all I can commit to right now without compromising the company's operations," Samuel replied, his voice unwavering. "But I invite you and anyone else to join us in overseeing this process. I want to ensure that we don't just meet the goals, but do so transparently." Marcus looked at Samuel, his eyes reflecting surprise. "You really want us to be involved in oversight?" he asked, his voice hesitant yet curious. "Yes," Samuel replied, turning to Marcus. "I want you to have a voice in this process, because only by working together can we bring about real change." The room fell silent for a moment before a few people began clapping. Marcus glanced around, his eyes brightening as he noticed the positive reactions. Garland, though silent, was clearly unimpressed. He sat down, arms crossed, his face betraying no emotion. Samuel took a deep breath, feeling a sense of relief. While not everyone was convinced, he knew he had taken an important first step. But he also understood this was only the beginning. The real work was yet to come. As the meeting concluded, Marcus approached Samuel. "I want to be involved," he said quietly but firmly. "If you're serious, I'll do everything I can to help." Samuel smiled, placing a hand on Marcus's shoulder. "Thank you. I truly appreciate that." From a distance, Garland watched the exchange before turning away and leaving. Samuel knew Garland wouldn't give up easily, but he also recognized that winning over Marcus was a small victory, and small victories are the foundation of meaningful change.